Morning and welcome. I'm Steve Call. I'm the president of the New America Foundation, and I'm here just for a minute to say hello and to welcome you and to set the stage for this morning's program, which promises to be fascinating. This event is not the first time that New America and Slate have collaborated, but it does start the launch of a series that I just wanted to call to your attention. Slate and New America intend over the next year or more to develop a whole series of convenings of this type about the intersection between emerging technology and public policy, with a particular eye on the way that technology is forcing institutions and policymakers in Washington to change the way they think about their own challenges and the way they go about their work. We have a pattern in this country of extraordinary innovation that has shaped a lot of the way we live and a lot of the way people around the world live. Washington is often the last part of America to learn about these innovations and to think them through in relation to public policy. And so we think that it might be useful for an institution like ours and a magazine like Slate to try to connect that pipeline a little bit better and to warn Washington about strategic surprises that are coming from technological change, and also to examine with innovators in Washington, such as some of the people you'll hear from today, how technology can make government more effective. So that's the purpose of this series, and this is the first in what I hope will be a rich body of work. Jacob's violation is a timely reminder that was actually programmed in his phone. That's what the iPhone does, for me to be reminded of my housekeeping role, which is to remind you to silence all your phones, and also to remind you that we're on the record here. We're being webcasted live. There's often an audience just as large, actually usually larger than is in the room, that's watching, so be conscious of that when the time comes for questions. Please wait for the microphone. Please do not make long speeches. Please do ask questions, but also be aware that you're on the record. With that, I just wanted to invite Jacob to make a few remarks, and we'll turn it over to Peter and the panel.
Thank you, Steve, and I'll be very brief. But I want to thank you all for coming. We're weather challenged today. This may be one of the themes of the Slate New America partnership. I'm, by the way, Jacob Weisberg, the chairman of the Slate Group, and this partnership was really cooked up on the theory that Slate and New America are interested in a lot of the same things. We're really interested in technology. We're interested in the societal implications of technology. We're interested in the policy implications of technology. We're interested in stuff that makes you say, wow, that's really cool. I didn't know about that. I hadn't thought about that. And I think also Slate and New America are interested in some of those things in the same way. We're pragmatic. We care about the actual implications of things. We try to be as non-ideological, as non-political as possible. And we're really focused on the future and what these things mean for the future, which is why we've given this partnership the label of future tense. And I think this first event is a tremendous example of that. Chris Wilson, who sitting in the front row, are one of our young technology and journalism geniuses at Slate, came to us with this idea for a series based on the story of how the military used social networking to help capture Saddam Hussein in Iraq after the American invasion. And all of us had the same reaction, which is, wow, that's really cool. That's a story we don't know anything about. And obviously it has tremendous implications, because social networking, although not a hardware technology, is a theory and an idea that seems to have an influence on all sorts of things we've been doing right now. And I think the application of that to the military is to us a wide open field. And we have assembled a tremendous panel to talk about it today. I won't delay it any further except to introduce Peter Bergen, who's going to moderate today. Peter Bergen, I think, probably needs no introduction with this crowd. He is a senior analyst here at New America and the national security correspondent for CNN. Without further ado, I turn it over to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you for coming today. We're first going to show a brief video, about 5 minutes, related to Chris Wilson and the Slate series, which is so excellent, and Colonel Hickey's work. Then we're going to have the panel in the following order. Chris Wilson will go first, Colonel Hickey will go second, Matthew Alexander will go third, Matthew Matthews, that's a pseudonym. He has a different name. Was the interrogator in the Zakawi hunt and was instrumental in finding Zakawi. And then finally Scott Helfstein, who is a assistant professor at West Point and also at the Counterterrorism Center, and has done very interesting work on social networks as they relate to terrorism groups. So we'll go with the video now.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing.
A month into the Iraq War, Baghdad had fallen, U.S. Marines had famously pulled down that statue of Saddam Hussein, and yet we were still no closer to finding Saddam himself. At the time, we actually didn't know whether he had survived the initial invasion or not, but around that time a video surfaces showing Saddam Hussein and a couple of his bodyguards in Baghdad, somewhere around April 9th. In the video is one particular bodyguard wearing sunglasses and a brown striped shirt. He wasn't anyone we recognized, and he certainly wasn't on the deck of cards of the most wanted Iraqis going into the war. It would turn out, however, that this bodyguard, who would be nicknamed the Fat Man, would become essential to catching Saddam Hussein. So in mid-June, a man named Colonel Jim Hickey takes over one of the brigades of the 4th Infantry Division. And he's looking over the information that his intelligence analysts have gathered, and he realizes that it's very hard to make heads or tails of what they've determined. So what he asks them to do is essentially make a network diagram, to show me who these people are and how they relate to each other. Unlike a traditional diagram of a hierarchy where you have the leader at the very top, this network diagram had Saddam at the very center in this big yellow dot. And then connected to him were his closest associates from the insurgency. So while there were some big names on there, people who were in the deck of cards, a lot of the people U.S. forces were discovering were families in Tikrit who weren't particularly high on the radar going into the war. And in fact, they discovered that there were 5 families, kind of like the New York Mafia, who really kind of controlled things in Tikrit. One of the first big breakthroughs was the raid on Muhammad al-Hadoshi's farm in June. They had a slim hope that they might actually catch Saddam on the premises. Obviously they didn't, but they found $8 million in cash, all these sophisticated weapons, sniper rifles and night vision goggles. And yet the most important thing that they found was what was basically Saddam's family photo album. The commander of the 122 Infantry, a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Steve Russell, would take these photos to informants that he had gathered and say, who's this guy, who's this guy? And that really helped them kind of flesh out this network diagram with, more names of people who clearly, at least at some point, had been very close to Saddam. We eventually figured out that 2 people were extremely important to both the insurgency and the hunt for Saddam. They were brothers whose names were Rudman and Mohammed al-Muslit. The al-Muslits were a very, very important family in Tikrit that had direct familial ties to the Saddam family. After much, much searching, we finally tracked down Rudman in early November. Unfortunately, he dies of a coronary 24 hours later. This was a huge setback, a huge disappointment for the people who were chasing Saddam because they were reasonably certain that this guy knew where Saddam was. But it also kind of clues the U.S. troops into the fact that maybe Muhammad was actually more important than Rudman. So Muhammad al-Muslit becomes the #1 target in the search for Saddam Hussein. The Special Forces team tracks him to a fishing farm where he was known to like to fish with a couple of buddies. Didn't catch him, but did catch a couple of younger fishermen who knew him. That trail leads them eventually to Baghdad, where one of his close fishing buddies had a property that they thought Muhammad al-Muslit, the Fat Man, might be hiding out in. There's a person who's very important to this story named Eric Maddox, who's a interrogator with the Special Forces team. He hears that a couple of guys were picked up at this Baghdad location that the fishermen had identified, but was told at first that nobody important was really picked up. But after interrogating some of the others who were picked up, he begins to realize maybe we actually got Muhammad and didn't realize it. So he runs to the holding cell, and he goes in, he's lifting up the hoods of these detainees, and lo and behold, the very last one he looks at is the Fat Man himself. So the Special Forces interrogator, Eric Maddox, immediately begins questioning Muhammad al-Muslit. And within a matter of hours, he's actually broken down and drawn a little map of where Saddam Hussein is hiding. So the troops kind of scan the area, they don't find Saddam. At first, it's beginning to look like maybe it's yet another dry hole, as they call them, when no targets are found. And finally, the Fat Man points to a location in the ground. It's kind of concealed by debris. and they uncover it to find a small hole in the ground, which we all famously know as the spider hole. And inside, lo and behold, was Saddam Hussein himself. If the U.S. officers in Tikrit hadn't realized early on that they had to think of the insurgency as a network as opposed to a hierarchy the way we've traditionally thought of enemies organized in armies, then who knows how long the hunt for Saddam Hussein would have gone on.
Well, if the panel could come up and we can begin the...
Hey, thanks for coming, everybody. I'm not going to use my full 10 minutes because the gentlemen to my right are a lot more interesting. So I just want to talk very briefly about why this story interested me so much. And the way I found out about it was that Colonel Hickey's operations officer, a man named Lieutenant Colonel Brian Reed, when he got back from his tour in Iraq, he actually got his PhD in sociology and wrote his dissertation on Saddam Hussein's social network. And what had been a kind of informal process of building out this network diagram in Iraq, he then considered in a very formal way using sort of social network theory, which at this point is a very sophisticated sort of discipline, with lots of sort of very rigorous statistical methods for learning things about the network that may not sort of be entirely intuitive. And so, as I was reading through this dissertation, which was, written very sort of straightforward as an academic exploration of this network, this, story begins to emerge of how, Saddam Hussein was actually captured. And so what it represents is just a very interesting union of scholarship and warfare. That, on the one hand, we have these sort of very fascinating ideas, and on the other hand, we actually get to see them play out on the ground and kind of see where that union takes place between, the very practical matter of, fighting an insurgency and trying to bring stability to a region, as well as the sort of more cerebral matter of how one thinks about how the enemy is organized. And so, what I'm sort of hoping that, or what I'm looking forward to hearing from my co-panelists today is just kind of what progress we've made in really thinking very sort of closely about how an enemy is organized. And when I was finishing this series, the editor said that I had to talk about Osama bin Laden and why we haven't caught him, which I didn't want to do because I didn't know the answer. But I asked some people who had some opinions on it, and they were saying that in a way Al-Qaeda is just not organized in the same way that the insurgency in Iraq in 2003 was organized. It is not based on sort of as much on these very close family ties. I've gotten a lot of mileage out of one of Steve's quotes from the New Yorker, where he compared Al-Qaeda to kind of a jihadist Mary Kay organization with a kind of direct marketing scheme, but where instead of I believe the quote was, instead of a pink Cadillac, you get eternal martyrdom. So merely making a sort of network diagram, I mean, it's a good start if the enemy is, you think, organized as a network, but not all networks are created equal, and that's where I think there's still a lot of really interesting work to be done.
Thank you, Colonel Hickey.
Well, when I saw Chris's short video, it sort of reminded me of my wife and I's journey this morning. Never losing sight of our aim, we sort of dealt with the friction and fog of the traffic patterns of Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C., and there was a little bit of heat and friction in the car as we debated whether or not we should have gone left or right. And she's really good at explaining, well, we should have gone left back there. And I said, well, we'll just press on here to the right. And mind you, there's a car trying to cut us off here. So, but we did achieve our objective, not necessarily along the route we had planned, or at least the route she had planned. But we did get to our objective on time and in good order. And I think in a lot of ways, when you find yourself in the middle of the theater of war, you have to accept that there's going to be a lot of friction and fog in the battlefield, and uncertainty is very much the rule of the day. But you shouldn't lose sight of your aim. So what I'll try to do is take you back in time a few years ago and try to explain how we saw the situation back in the summer of 2003 in the middle of Mesopotamia, around Tikrit, along the Tigris River. I would take command of the 1st Brigade of the 4th Infantry Division. At any given time, between 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers, depending on how we are organized. The area of operation of the brigade was thousands of square kilometers. It was about 150 kilometers north to south and about 100 kilometers east to west. To the north was the high ground that separated central Iraq from northern Iraq, defined by Jabal Makul and Jabal Hamran Ridgeline. Through the center went the Tigris River. To the south was the city of Samarra. To the west was Lake Tharthar, a large central lake in Iraq, and to the right, or to the east, the Jabal Hamran Ridge, which separated the Sunni part of Iraq with the people in and around Kirkuk, the Kurds. Hundreds of thousands of people throughout the area of various groups, from Bedou, who would never step foot in any type of a town, to Sunni Arabs that pretty much dominated the area, many of whom were Baathists of various degrees, to some Shia that would work down in Samarra or do labor in Beji, the large oil refinery in Iraq, or do labor in Tikrit. So as Iraq goes, a pretty mixed population, small towns, larger cities like Tikrit, but most of it was pastoral. Huge agricultural belt on either side of the river. So pretty complex place as things go, as people live out their lives in that part of the world. Within that group of people were thousands of trained and armed soldiers of a Republican Guard Corps that was not engaged and defeated by American ground troops when we invaded that portion of Iraq. Those men were alive and well and armed and organized, and they were shooting at us and killing and wounding the soldiers of the brigade on a pretty routine basis. In and around that group, that military chain of command and those soldiers were a significant portion of survivors of the Ba'athist regime that had moved from Baghdad and moved up to their hometown area of Tikrit, some of whom went further north up to Mosul. So you had a political elite, a military elite, hiding among a pretty diverse civilian population over a large swath of land that was pretty diverse in its nature geographically. We did not speak their language. We moved into a part of the world where American soldiers had never been before, though scores of other foreign armies had been throughout the history of that part of the world, and it was violent. Our mission was to stabilize the area. The idea that the war was over, we were trying to return Iraq back to a peaceable, self-governing country. Tikrit was a part of that area. That was my mission with the brigade. So we clearly had combat operations to conduct. But as importantly, and some would argue more importantly, we had civil military operations to conduct to sort of get governance back in place, ensure the economy would get back on its basic footing, to achieve a basic stability. Now, given the uncertainty of the area, the basic nature of combat and war, given the fact that we didn't know a whole lot about the area or information about some of our specific objectives, many of which were just simply military objectives, we had to gather information. And we had to gather it quickly. And what information we gathered, we had to make sense out of relative to what we thought we wanted to achieve. And where you get that information in a situation like this is from the people. And you got to figure out how to communicate with them, and you got to figure out what their goals and objectives are. And sometimes you can find a confluence of interests. One thing we learned about the people there is they weren't all tied in with the Ba'athist regime, and they certainly weren't loyal to Saddam Hussein. And many of them had stories to tell, and they're willing to tell us those stories. And it became clear to me that if we didn't know something, it was probably because we weren't asking the right question or we weren't engaging the right people, whether it were a group of imams, a group of self-styled sheikhs, people who wanted to come into the government that we were forming in Laden, which, by the way, is still in place. You just had to figure out people's motives. And you had to take things with a grain of salt, but at times you just had to take things at face value in order to develop a template that would begin to make sense out of what you're seeing and hearing. This is not a linear process. You're in the middle of a fight, and soldiers around you are being killed and wounded. You yourself are under a lot of danger when you're out there, but you have to be out there in order to gather information. Because in the long run, you're not going to accomplish your mission if you don't have that information. It's heuristic, trial and error. You've got to go out there, try something, and see what happens. In the course of this effort to stabilize the area, we learned rather quickly that there were many senior members of the former regime that were out there, and we posited were involved in organizing or at least motivating the resistance that we were up against, the armed resistance we were up against. And in my mind, for me to gain the initiative, to be able to set the terms of battle, I had to go after that leadership, military or political, and find out exactly what was going on. We started picking up lots of senior members, some of whom were on the famous deck of cards, others were on other lists. But as we were doing this, and I was engaging my commanders and talking with certain Iraqi leaders that I had come to know, I realized there was a substrata below the official. And it was built around family ties, which seemed to make sense because when you would engage other sheikhs, the network, if you want to take the Al-Jabur tribe, for instance, which is the largest tribe in Iraq, it's made up of Shia, Sunni, and Kurds, but they identify with the idea of being part of this large national tribe. And their sense of authority and aim, their values, their norms come from this notion of being Al-Jaburi as opposed to Iraqi. And so if you look at the other Abu Nasr tribe or what have you, the odds are they would probably look at the world in the same way. And so when we started looking at the Hadoshi or the Majij or Al-Muslits, listening to certain people that were talking to us about how they were organized, it tended to make sense. So for some people, I guess we had an unconventional view of the enemy. In our view at the time, in the summer of 2003, we thought we had a very practical view of how the enemy was organized and how he was fighting us. And Steve Russell, one of my battalion commanders, has done a lot of research in this. In fact, many of the people we are physically fighting on the ground were blood relatives of some of the people that we were pursuing that we posited were part of this sort of informal senior leader chain of command directing operations against our troops. It tended to play out that way. Now, the hunt for Saddam Hussein. Nobody told us to go out and capture Saddam Hussein. In my mind, based upon what we are learning, I told my commanders repeatedly, it is my assessment that man is in our area. And if we could kill or capture him, it would probably have a calming effect on the area based upon the fear he and his regime instilled into the hearts and minds of the people that we were dealing with on a daily basis. Number two, it could probably disrupt their ability to direct operations, finance operations, what have you. But that was not our central focus. He was a target of opportunity. And if we could find him, it would probably settle things down in our area. Needless to say, we had an understanding that would create opportunities at a strategic level for our senior leaders. But we are a little bit more prosaic, I guess, in our view of things. We just wanted to get things accomplished in our area and settle things down. Being trained to understand objectives 2 levels above me and knowing that I have a professional responsibility to seize the initiative if presented the opportunity, I drove my staff and my commanders hard to see if we could make this happen. There's a very clear public record of this because we were very open with the press while we were doing this at the time. Now, I guess my final point is this, is teamwork. We operated on a wide front in very dispersed manner. We didn't live on big forward operating bases. I had small elements throughout the entire area. I personally spent a lot of time out on the field, day and night, engaging all my junior leaders in a very collaborative sort of way of doing business. But we did things in a very flexible way, focused way. Every operation we did was driven by information or intelligence because we knew 80% of the people in our area really didn't have a stake in the fight. There were some hardcore people we had to deal with. There were some people that were clearly assisting us. But the majority of people didn't have a stake in the fight, and we didn't want to alienate them. And in fact, they were our source of information on any given day. But being dispersed, being decentralized, collaborative chain of command, exchanging information up and down the chain of command, implicit in all this is a teamwork, not only with soldiers within the brigade proper, but with soldiers from the Special Operations Command of a couple different variety. All young soldiers, combat leaders, working together, pursuing opportunities, exchanging information. We did not keep information in stovepipes. We did not run things up the chain of command to seek permission or seek approval or to gather information from them because there wasn't a whole lot forthcoming from higher headquarters. The information came from below, and it was our duty to exploit and to work together as a team. And I guess that's my final point is the teaming of people in an unknown, uncertain situation like that is of vital importance. And the leaders should be on notice that it is their duty to sort of make that happen. And I had the pleasure to lead absolutely outstanding combat leaders who were very flexible in their thoughts, very forthcoming in their opinions, and we were able to achieve something we really did not set out to achieve at the beginning of the campaign. And oh, by the way, when he was captured, what we had posited indeed happened. The violence dropped off dramatically. And as I conferred with General Odierno a couple weeks ago at his quarters at Fort Myer, we take that, both he and I take that as a point of pride that the benchmark for success in Iraq was the levels of violence in the spring of 2004. And we think we made that happen to a large degree and spared the lives of a lot of people in the meantime by bringing down that level of violence, if only for a period of time. But that was our aim. That's what we're able to achieve. And I think for a period of time, there was a window of opportunity. And that's all we could have done at the time. So with that, I'll be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel Hickey, and we'll turn it over to Matthew Alexander now.
I was an interrogator in Iraq in 2006 and led an interrogations team that hunted down Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. So I have very similar experiences in using social networking to track down leaders of terrorist groups. How was social networking important to interrogations? I would say in two ways. The first is that it gives an interrogator situational awareness, which allows them to better use the interrogation techniques that are in the Army Field Manual or that have been adopted from law enforcement. The best way to explain that is to give you an example. We caught, at one point in the hunt for Zarqawi, we caught 4 guys who had just left a house where foreign fighters were based. And we brought them back to the prison and we separated them and began interrogating them. And one of them, it was very clear from the way that he held himself, and he looked like he had just walked into the prison out of the Tony and Guy salon down here. He's very coiffured and manicured. And it was obvious that he was the leader of the group, and the 3 men caught with him were obviously just farmers who had become involved in the insurgency. What I did, I was interrogating the leader, who I'll call Tariq, and I went to one of my other interrogators on my team who was interrogating one of the farmers and said, could you have him write a statement that says Tariq is not responsible for our capture? And he went in and the farmer wrote that Tariq is not responsible for our capture, and I took it out, and with an interpreter I traced it onto a new piece of paper, but I took out the Arabic for not. So I now had a statement that said Tariq is responsible for our capture. Now you can walk out here and grab any DC detective who works criminal cases that involve gangs or drug narcotics groups, and they can tell you this technique. But Army interrogators are not trained on this type of technique. It's basically a form of what we call a prisoner's dilemma. And I took that statement into Tariq, and I used it. I showed it to him, and he became very infuriated that somebody much lower than him, and if you know anything about Arab culture, you know that it can be quite insulting for somebody low on the totem pole to write something like that about the person that's in charge. It has to do with cultural concepts like wasta and respect in hierarchical societies. And it convinced Tariq to dime out everything about his friend, and in the process, he ended up telling me all about foreign fighters and how they were funneled into Iraq, and which eventually led him to admit that he was the leader of Saddam province, which where Colonel Hickey worked, and also was connected to the people who bombed the Golden Dome Mosque. None of that would have been possible if we didn't have social networking to understand the relationships between Tariq and the men that he worked with and the other people who were funneling foreign fighters into Iraq. And so in that way, social networking gives an interrogator the situational awareness to be able to use the techniques that we have available better. The other way is an evidence-based model in which we use information to use approaches such as we know all, where we try to confront a detainee with everything that we do know to convince them that it's futile to not cooperate because we already know everything. This is a technique that was used very effectively in World War II by a famous German interrogator named Hans Scharf. He used that very effectively against downed Allied pilots by using a very methodical categorization system and data collection system based on social networking of who knew who and who spent time with who in the club back in England before they flew missions. So they were using it back then manually. There was an interrogator in Vietnam who worked for the CIA named Orrin DeForest who did the same thing to map out social networks to be able to solve the North Vietnamese infiltration of South Vietnam and how they were organized politically. And it was the first time that we had that information, and that was in 1970, I believe. So social networking has always been completely or integrated into interrogations methodology. I had the chance to do a speaking tour with Eric Maddox, the interrogator that you saw here, who helped find Saddam last year. And two things I learned from Eric that I think if he was here he would say that I found fascinating was, one, that sometimes you have to work down to work up. And social networking allows you to see that. When I was chasing Zarqawi, one of our catchphrases was, don't worry about going down the ladder, always work up. Because our task force had one mission, which was to find Zarqawi, we didn't worry so much about people who were low on the totem pole. But you learn very quickly that somebody low might have the key piece of information that can get you where you're going versus somebody who's high up. And the other thing I think that I thought was just very brilliant that Eric says is innocent people might not have information, but they can tell you what questions to ask. And that's very important when it comes to how we treat detainees, because people who are not involved, if not treated well, are not going to help us and not tell us what questions to ask when we do catch people who are involved. But at the end of the day, I think one of the things that we could improve on, and which we've touched base on here, is that one of my friends who's still an instructor in the interrogator course says that interrogators are still taught strict order of battle questioning. In other words, they're taught to go in and ask, who's your commander, who's your logistics guy? And I'm sure once they go into the practical parts of the instruction where they're sitting in a booth practicing against their instructor, if their instructor has experience, they tell them differently. But I used to tell my interrogators is, imagine you drop a plate of spaghetti and meatballs on your kitchen floor. That's what Al-Qaeda looks like organizationally. The guy who's a logistician today to us, who might be a weapons guy, might tomorrow be the religious counselor, and the next day be a money guy, and the next day be out setting up an IED. The roles are interchangeable. And so if I was going to take that social networking that we saw up here, that wire diagram with pieces, and make that even more real, I would take the pieces and they would be shifting, and the lines would be appearing and disappearing, because it's a very dynamic model. I just want to talk real quick about interrogators themselves, who they are, and how we could help them become better. The first thing I'll say is interrogators are smart, extremely smart, and I'm completely convinced that we're smarter than Al-Qaeda. And my experience tells me that. And one of the most disappointing parts of the debate over enhanced interrogation techniques to me is that it's an insult to me as someone who's been an interrogator and to other interrogators. Imagine walking up to an infantry person and saying, we're going to give you all chemical weapons because we don't think that you have the ability to go out and capture a hill without them, even though they violate the law, regulations, Geneva Conventions. It'd be very insulting to them. We, as interrogators, believe wholeheartedly that we can win the battle of wits in the interrogation room without the use of enhanced interrogation techniques. Your basic interrogator in the Army, which makes up about 80% of all our interrogators in this conflict, is straight out of basic training, might have a year of language skill in interrogator school, which is about 5 months. So typically the average age of an interrogator in the field is about 22, 23. I heard those reactions. I'm going to tell you that's a good thing. I would prefer to have younger interrogators than older ones, and I'm a little bit of the minority voice on this. Experience and maturity, I don't think, have anything to do with making someone a good interrogator. It's an open mind about culture, the ability to learn, the ability to be empathetic, and the ability to build relationships with cultural knowledge. Our young people today, Generation X and Generation Y, whatever you want to call them, are particularly well suited to be interrogators. And the reason why is because of things like Facebook and the internet. They have a thirst for knowledge, they understand relationships, and they understand networking. And the other reason why is because they watch a lot of reality TV. Interrogations are all about emotions. That's your biggest weapon in an interrogation, I'm telling you, is the detainee's emotions and your ability to sway them. And when you watch reality TV every day, you can see quite a bit of drama involving emotions. And interrogators who grew up in that culture, they intuitively understand that concept, that you can sway people with emotions. And I also argue, and I'm the minority voice on this also, that we shouldn't train more interrogators on Arabic. What we should do is train more interpreters to be good interpreters. And the reason why is because I had people on my team in Iraq who were trained Arabic linguists, and they couldn't interrogate in Arabic because there was 14 dialects in Iraq. Secondly, interrogation is very nuanced, and so it's very difficult to have the complete language skills that would be able to use. But the other thing is, why would we want to take out the asset of having an interpreter who grew up in that culture out of the interrogation booth? That is a cultural encyclopedia, a Facebook, if you will, also, that's sitting in the room with you. It's an asset. We should spend those resources not on training interrogators to be proficient in language, but on training better interpreters. So the last thing I'll say is that interrogators, as many people have pointed out, and especially recently in the news, the large majority of our information about Al-Qaeda and that allows us to target people comes from interrogations. And yet the resources that we spend on interrogators are very minimum. I think it's improving, but I can tell you that out in the field, just the conditions in which interrogators work, and I'll give you one example, every interrogation booth we had did not have soundproof walls. So that when I was sitting in one booth, I could hear what was happening in the interrogation booth next to me. And we'll go out and we'll spend a lot of money to give soldiers the correct weapon so they can go out and shoot targets. But I don't think we're spending the same amount of resources on the interrogators who find those targets. And I think if we give them the right resources in training and education, especially on things like social networking, then they'll be more than capable of accomplishing the mission.
Matthew, I wonder if you could just summarize briefly how you found Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, because...
The trick to finding Zarqawi actually came down to one guy who was a religious advisor within Al-Qaeda, and he was advising the number 2 in Al-Qaeda at the time, Abu Ayyub al-Masri. But basically, the technique that I used to convince him to cooperate was that I played up his ego. This guy was the Hannibal Lecter, if you will, of Al-Qaeda, literally almost exactly in demeanor and attitude as Anthony Hopkins' character in that movie. But he had a grand ego. And where the initial interrogations approach by other interrogators was to tear down that ego and to dominate him and make him feel subservient to where he would cooperate, my approach, which only took a matter of hours, was to go up and build that ego and then use that against him by offering him a chance to play a role in the future of Iraq, which would be even higher than what he was playing already. And I was able, the biggest reason I think he trusted me and went for that is because, one, I brought a copy of the Quran into the interrogation booth, and I quoted from it, and I discussed religion with him, which interrogators are taught to never discuss religion, and I think that's wrong. I'm the only interrogator I know who's ever read the Quran, but if we had more knowledge about the religion and could talk to him about it respectfully, we could establish those relationships of trust that would then allow us to convince people to work with us and not Al-Qaeda.
Great. Actually, if everybody can move down, because Scott, being a West Point instructor, has slides.
I apologize. I wouldn't be, as Peter pointed out, a good West Point instructor or a good DoD employee if I didn't come with my visuals. So I'm obviously batting cleanup on what was a great panel of knowledgeable people that have used this stuff in the field. And I want to talk to you about some other ways, actually, we could go about using some of the social network technology. And the work I'm presenting is actually a cooperative effort with a colleague of mine, Dominic Wright. Maybe. Okay. So, there we go. Which button was that?
It's this one.
Not the bottom one. So, I want to start by actually offering a couple of caveats. First off, I am probably the most skeptical network science researcher you will ever meet. I do not necessarily think networks or our understanding of networks will save the world. I'm yet to be convinced of that, in large part because I don't think anybody's come close to proving it. Within terrorism studies, I'll get on the soapbox even slightly higher here and offer a couple words of caution. It's really easy to talk about terrorist networks, but simply saying terrorist networks is a redundancy. Everything is a network. As soon as we all came into this room, we became a network. Every corporation is a network. Every government bureaucracy is a network. We have networks fighting networks already, right? It's just about how we think of it. Do we think about it in terms of hierarchy, or do we think about it in terms of relations? The other thing I would point out is that the concept of terrorist networks is wholly overused and underleveraged. A few months ago, a Google Scholar search on terrorist networks, so this is just academic articles, returned something like 3,500 results. How many of them actually went and did network analysis? It is no more than a handful. No more than 4 or 5 have actually gone and looked at what these networks look like. So I think that there's a lot of work we could do to understand this more and move from talking about it to actually going and trying to understand it. So while I don't think this is a panacea, I think there are a lot of uses. Today we've heard about how it could be useful in manhunting. But there's a step before manhunting, which is how do we know who to hunt? That whole discussion we had about the fat man and his importance in the hunt for Saddam highlights the fact that we got to understand who in there is really key. And it's networks that help us get to that stage. And as it turns out, there's also some broader stuff, broader material that we can glean from studying them. So we started by looking at attack networks, attack cells. These are the people that actually go out and blow things up. And so they've gone from being ideologically motivated to operational. And we started with the tactical issues that we've discussed today. What are the characteristics of connected people? What do the cells look like? How do we take them apart? Do they even matter for the outcomes that they produce in terms of casualties and the like? But what we found as we began to dig down is that there are much broader strategic implications, and that by thinking about where the cells come from in an organization and what they look like, we could actually understand a lot of the threat we face without actually seeing it. So when I talk about attack cells, this is the evolution of the Madrid cell. This is how it came to be over 6 snapshots. And simply with networks, the little dots there are the people, and the lines are the connections between them. It's the interpersonal relationships. And in this case, right, the ultimate result was a number of destroyed trains. This is just to show you that there is method to the madness, right? We're not just making this stuff up, right? There are numbers, there are formulas. I promise it's Friday morning, and I will not in any way get into them, and we'll turn this slide off actually in about 5 more seconds. But the irony is that a lot of it's not very difficult, especially the basic materials of counting somebody's connections. So what we learned when we started with this individual level, this first level of analysis, when we looked across the personal characteristics, and we only had a few attacks to work with. We only had 6 attacks out of Europe and Southeast Asia, and the problem here is getting the development over time is very difficult because we don't tend to track that. Towards the latter part of the presentation, I'll show a sample of 25 attacks where we've got the snapshot at the time of the attack. We're much better at doing that than understanding how they develop, which I think is unfortunately still a big weakness that we need to overcome. But we found that well-educated people tended to have more connections than those without. Perhaps because these networks start as ideologically driven networks. And it's those intelligent people that get the respect of their peers and that they're able to motivate others to action. That was one theory we had. We also looked at operational role. Now, as was pointed out immediately earlier, operational roles move around. And this is not necessarily a firm thing. You could be a logistician and a recruiter. So we had to do the best we could. And what we found was that logisticians, who are also well educated, tend to be better connected. We also found that there was this threshold point where cells move from the ideological to the operational realm. And the ideological break shows that recruiters and emirs become less important, and weapons acquisitions people become more important. So they're moving from the point of talking about it, of being motivated to it, to actually going out and trying to get the pieces in place. And keep in mind that it's the network through which those ideas and those resources flow. And so the better we understand those networks, the better we understand how an attack can come to happen. The other thing we found was that history matters. So if you had a lot of connections in the past, you're likely to have them in the future. And that's a valuable thing to know. The next thing we looked at was, what do these cells actually look like? After all, there's all this discussion about targeted removal. Can we go in and break apart these cells by pulling out specific people? And here, we found that there were two dominant stories. One of them comes out of the practitioner realm, and that is groups organized for operational security. Thin networks, minimal connections. If one person is arrested or killed, they can't have too much information. Some piece of the cell could break off. It's not necessarily catastrophic to the rest. This is the way we would, if we tried as practitioners, design networks to be as secure as possible and compartmentalize information. So that's one theory. The other one is based out of network theory. And this is that networks are scale-free. Quick, fast rule of thumb, 20% of the people have 80% of the connections. It's one more of those 80-20 rules in nature. And so there are these hubs, and then everything moves out from them. And we observe these from everywhere, from biology to technology. So it's not surprising that network scientists, when they started running simulations, right, theoretical models of how to break apart networks, they said, well, we're going to start from this assumption. It made sense to see if that was right, especially because those are the networks that are particularly vulnerable to targeted removal. Because if you could find those hubs and pluck them out, then you could essentially cut people off from one another. So we went and looked at this, and from an operational security standpoint, the minimum number of links to connect to any one of those dots is that blue sloping line at the bottom. That would be an operationally secure network. What we find is that the vast majorities weren't. They had 50% more links than they needed for minimal connection. They had 70% more links than they needed for minimal connection. And they all got more links, they all grew more connected and less secure over time. So that's a really valuable thing for us to know. When we looked across the scale-free assumption, where we would expect to see a graph that is up top, that has a long sloping power law type of a curve. Sorry, one more math term, I'm done after that. Power law type of a curve. This is the evolution of one of the Bali attacks. And so we see that in reality, it's all over the place. And if you've got a network that's everybody's got 3 or 4 connections, pulling out one person doesn't make that big of a difference. Maybe you get those 3 or 4 connections they're tied to, but if there's 60 connections, you haven't really pulled it apart. There's no hub that you could really go in and pull out. So we found that neither of these are really well supported. This looks wholly different than what is expected from both the practitioner and the scholar realm. And ultimately, these networks are structurally resilient. So even if we go and we try to pick people off, they've got this capability to continue functioning. And we saw this in Southeast Asia after groups were able to carry out Jamaat Islamiyah, were able to carry out attacks, and they would be arrested, they would be killed, and yet somehow there would be some core that could reconstitute and come back together. And so they really did display tremendous resilience. The last thing we looked at, and this started to unravel a whole host of things which we are now looking into, was what's the effect between the network structure and the outcomes that these groups can produce. And there was really no expectation one way or the other. Are denser networks better at killing people than looser networks? Who knows? Why should we assume that there's any relationship? And in the first set of things we looked at, there were none. We couldn't find anything. So we went out and we were able to get more information on about 25 attacks, different attacks. And we plotted them up again, which is the plot with the blue dots. And once again, there was no discernible pattern, which seemed like networks would be irrelevant in producing the ultimate outcome that we care about most, which is the casualties on a tactical level. Of course, strategic outcomes, there could be all different types of influence dynamics. But when we looked across, when we actually started to categorize and use a topology to understand these groups based on whether they came from the core of a network, the periphery of a network, or the surrounding movement. So unconnected but motivated by, we started to find a lot of patterns. We could link that topology both to the types of attacks and the outcomes of attacks that were carried out, as well as what the network looked like. And so there is the possibility that we could reverse engineer these network structures to understand, based on these attack networks, what type of network they came from, and therefore what the capabilities of our strategic adversary are within any localized theater, which I think is very exciting. So, my final remarks, there is a lot we can do here. We can continue to use this in really very rudimentary ways and more complex ways to understand the threat that we face in terms of who's connected, when they're activated, when we expect changes, and what those changes mean. But we need to recognize that even within the manhunting context, there are very few places where removing a single person is going to somehow, or a couple people is going to crash the network. The U.S. government, special forces, intelligence have been tremendously capable of killing or capturing Al Qaeda's operational chief. Right? There was one point in there where it was like the worst job to have. You had a 4.5-month tenure, and then you were out the door one way or another. So we are tremendously proficient, and yet despite that, Al Qaeda was still able to continue as both a networked organization and a wider social movement. And so looking for that silver bullet, I think, is a little bit of a mistake, and we need to understand the structural resilience and start to figure out how to attack that. And then finally, the strategic implications, I think, could potentially be fascinating, and hopefully I'll have an opportunity to come back in the future and tell you more as we continue to unpack that. So I appreciate your time this morning.
Great. So let's go to Q&A. Everybody can come back on the stage. If you have a question, please identify yourself and your affiliation. And if you have a particular person that you want to address a question to, make that clear as well. And we have a mic over here.
Hugh McElrath, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. When we saw the prospectus for this event, it was easy to make the assumption that we were talking about social networking via electronic media such as Facebook. And I wonder if anyone would care to comment on the extent to which persons of interest, terrorists, are actually online, or is that an artifact of our sort of American bias?
Well, let me just try and answer that. I mean, for obvious reasons, Osama bin Laden doesn't have a Twitter account or a Facebook account, and there is an operational security problem. I mean, we had an event yesterday in which there was a longer answer to this, but essentially, the security problems surrounding a more open Web 2.0 kind of presence are really a big problem for Al Qaeda. So, and the nearest thing they've got to something like that was a Q&A session by Ayman al-Zawahiri on the internet about it a little over a year ago, which basically turned out to be a total disaster. He took some questions, but they were mostly very hostile questions about why are you killing Muslim civilians, which he answered in a very inarticulate way. So the short answer is from a terrorist point of view, these kinds of networks and Facebook and Twitter don't make any sense at all. Go ahead.
In my book, How to Break a Terrorist, I talk a little bit about that, but of course there's a lot of things I couldn't talk about. But we captured a guy who was basically Al-Qaeda's media man for Iraq. He would have been the public relations director or what have you, communications director. Al-Qaeda definitely is using those tools in some cases very sophisticated manners, leveraging them. But we also caught a guy who was very low down on the ladder, who was basically like their website designer, who would take the videos of suicide attacks or other attacks against coalition forces or beheading videos, and then he would add graphics, lines from the Quran, and then build websites, and then those would be posted. But Al-Qaeda understands how to leverage technology. And as we addressed here at the end of the discussion, they understand that this war isn't about terrorist attacks. As we heard last night from Phil Mudd in another discussion, they understand that this is about recruitment and how technology they can leverage that to recruit new people. So they certainly understand the advantage of technology and how it can be used to further their aims, which isn't necessarily about terrorist attacks. It's about getting more people.
Hi, Celia Wexler, Union of Concerned Scientists. You mentioned, I think, an interesting point about the allocation of resources and maybe more resources for the development of interpreters. And I wondered, all this incredibly interesting and wonderful information, is it getting to Congress? And this is my way of putting in a plug for restoring something that we're working on, restoring the Office of Technology Assessment. So I would love any kind of comments about whether this kind of information is getting to Congress, should get to Congress, etc.
I think just as applies to interrogations, yes, but some aren't listening. I mean, on any given day, you can hear congressmen calling for the restoration of the ability to use enhanced interrogation techniques, which we've known for, it's been an Army doctrine for at least 50 years, since 1949, the long-term negative consequences of using enhanced interrogation techniques. So I think there's some that just aren't listening. I've been to Congress several times. I've talked to groups of Republicans. I've talked judiciary hearings and Senate Armed Services Committee to try and restore the faith we have in interrogators and to resource them properly. So I do think there are changes, and I do know that the Army is adopting some of those recommendations and is improving the training of interrogators.
I might add only that I know this is an important cause for the Union of Concerned Scientists, that if we have more scientists themselves in Congress, then, certainly there'll always be a small minority, but having people like Representative Vern Ehlers, who I believe unfortunately is retiring, and who would support the restoration of the OTA, will bring, a kind of the mindset that people like Matthew are looking for.
Thanks. My name is Lee Diamond. You just mentioned that I'd say Rush Holt is a really great person. Talking about Bin Laden, pursuing Bin Laden and pursuing Hussein, it seems to me that, Iraq is perhaps a more open society when we think about it than Afghanistan and Pakistan. Both seem to be very closed societies. And so in terms of questioning out in Pakistan and Afghanistan, wouldn't there be a greater need for presence of people like, you, Mr. Alexander, out in the field to, question people who are not per se suspects? And that would also go to the flexibility that the colonel was talking about. I wonder about, some of those thoughts about how to do this, better.
Colonel Hickey, perhaps you could, are there any lessons, do you think, from the hunt for Saddam that can be applied for the hunt for Bin Laden, or are they so different?
I have no personal experience with combat operations in Afghanistan. My time spent in Afghanistan is measured in days and hours. The terrain there is dramatically different. How the enemy fights there is dramatically different. How he's organized and how he's disposed on the field is completely different. It's a different set of unknowns. You have to sort out, and I trust the people on the ground are fighting and working very hard through all that. I would say when you move into an environment like this that is entirely foreign and you don't speak the language and there are groups of peoples out there with guns, you have to move forward carefully. As the Romans would say, festina lente, you just move forward assuredly but with care. But you cannot be reserved in your curiosity. You have to probe and gather information. And in a fight like this, the information comes from the people. One of the most important soldiers in my life was a young man who grew up in Michigan but spent much of his boyhood in Saudi Arabia. He drove a tank in 1st Battalion, 66 Armor Regiment. I had met him about 2 days after I took command when I was inspecting one of my units, and he was leaning over the side of a tank, and I asked him his name, and he clearly did not have parentage from Ireland or Germany or something. So I said, well, what is your background? And he told me his background, and I found out about a minute later he was fluent in Arabic. So he jumped in the back of my Humvee, and we changed his assignment on the spot. and he lived with me and fought with me for the next 9 months. He was a darn good soldier. He knew how to fight, and he kept my skin in one piece numerous times. But he could speak not only Arabic, but he could change his dialect. And he could speak to anybody out there in Iraq. And wherever I was, he was with me. And it allowed me to converse freely with anybody we ran into in the countryside or in the cities. Having struggled with a couple languages throughout my career and in education, I know how valuable that is. All I would say is you've got to speak the language, and you've got to be out there engaging the people. And this is no small thing. So if the people are your source of information in these insurgency-type battles or wars, you've got to be able to communicate with them. And then you've got to work hard to figure out what they value and how they structure their lives, how they practically apply their culture in order to sort of make sense out of what they're trying to tell you. And I'll give you a very concrete example. All of us in this room have grown up exposed to literate people, and we've all become literate. And we take literacy for granted. And we take concepts like drawings and maps for granted. And we begin to understand that these are representations of reality. But they're reliable. And we know that 3 kilometers is 3 kilometers is 3 kilometers, and if you go northwest on this bearing for 15 minutes at this rate of speed, you will end up here, and you can graphically portray it. That's just our world. Right? But if you go out into Mesopotamia, where people aren't literate, and they've probably never seen a map before in their life, and they walk up to one of your vehicles where you not only have a map, but you have a visual display of a map in real time with moving icons, and you ask them questions about where is this, or how far is it away, they'll look at that machine and they will not know what to make of it as you try to explain to them where you are and where you want to go. But they will tell you in their view of the world and in their words, filtered through a foreign language given to you by an interpreter. Well, what you've got to do is go over the mountain, and then there'll be a village. And in a long distance off to the west, you'll find this compound. And you'll think that they're talking about something that's 10, 20, 30 kilometers away. And you begin looking at your map and poring over it. And in their view of the world, they're talking about something that could be 1,500 meters away. So there is a huge difference in their view of the world from yours. And what you've got to do, if you're the one trying to shape the environment and take the initiative, you better work really hard and try to understand how they may see their world around them and how they interpret your question. And I can tell you that became painfully obvious to me late one night after we were conducting a routine patrol, and we came upon a couple individuals that in short order gave us information about an individual we had been looking for the better part of 6 months. And this is months after we had captured Saddam. And en route on that patrol that on that raid that I personally led, as we moved through these paths and trails in the area west of Tikrit, it became obvious to me that what we were doing that night I had learned about months prior when we conducted a questioning of somebody out in the field, and what that individual was describing to me months earlier, I was seeing that night. And it was the spatial relationship, and it was just completely different. And that's just one small example of how so-called cultural differences play out on the field. And again, you kind of learn that stuff the hard way. It's trial and error applies in an environment like that. And I'm not sure a whole lot of book learning on this end of the ocean is going to get you ready for that until you get out there. So it's a bit of a pile of spaghetti on the floor, I guess.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ryan Jessen with the Ballard Group. I really appreciate the discussion. The question's most likely directed to Mr. Alexander. As far as the networks go, and I think everyone's mentioned to a certain degree the dynamic nature of them, how frequently changing they are, whether you remove a person or a new person is inserted into the network. I'm curious as to how the communication is disseminated among interagencies, among fellow interrogators, because at one point a new person can be added to the network and somebody else may not know that. And so I'm curious about foreseeing that difficulty possibly with this network system is making sure everybody has kind of the same information about the network so that we're not having confusion.
I was fortunate because I worked in a joint task force, so we had people from all the different services and other government agencies working together. And so, above the interrogation unit is an intelligence unit that compiles all that, and I could only hope, I assume, that they were looking at information that was shared among all the agencies. What I can tell you is that at the ground level, the basic concept for the Army for an interrogation is what's called a tiger team, which is an analyst and an interrogator paired together. At Guantanamo Bay, this works perfect where you've got a set schedule and you have enough analysts that the analysts can observe every interrogation and then come back and discuss with the interrogator strategies and what information they need and links. In the field, when I was in Iraq, each analyst had probably 5 interrogators. And it was pretty much everything they could do just to be able to try and come up with a list of questions for each detainee every day that you could ask. So the pace and the limitation on the number of analysts we had, I think, limited our ability to access information that could have helped us in interrogations. And so the other part of that a little bit has to do with evidence. A lot of evidence that we would collect that could be very valuable, as we saw here with the photo album of Saddam Hussein. A lot of evidence that we collected sat on a shelf because we didn't have enough analysts, to go through it and analyze it and determine. When we had a high-value target, of course, we would look through that stuff, but it could be somebody fairly low. The story I told you about the guy Tariq, one of the things that was captured from somebody who worked for him was a ledger book that sat on a shelf for 2 weeks. And I had gone in there and looked at this evidence and found this ledger book which described every transaction that Al-Qaeda made in Salah al-Din province over a course of about a year. And there was a tremendous amount of intelligence value. But I think it's part resource is our limitation.
We've got 10 minutes left, so we're going to take some questions together and bunch them up so we can get to everything. Go ahead.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I want to ask about the implications for what we've been hearing this morning from the standpoint of who we need to recruit. And I start with a very simple set of questions, assuming you know the objective. Question is, what's the work? Who should do it? What do they need to know in order to be successful? When and how should they learn it? And whom do they need to be able to work with? And social networking is part of my title out at the Naval Postgraduate School. But I think this whole question it also seems to me that we have to start bringing more sociologists and social anthropologists into this world in which you're working. And I don't know whether or not that's being done yet, but it strikes me as an important thing. The other thing I would suggest you do is try to get your stories out to as many people as possible that you feel comfortable doing that with. I think what you had to tell us today was really rather fabulous, and I want to thank you all for doing this.
Thank you.
Rick Northrup with NationalSecurityReports.com. I was at a conference last week with George Quester at the University of Maryland, who made a point that during the 20s and 30s, most of the physicists working on the atomic question pretty much knew each other. They were professors, graduate students, went to the same seminars, interacted with each other. I was just curious whether you might know if that kind of social networking is being looked at today in terms of nuclear programs, perhaps in Iran or Pakistan.
Huh. Good question. So,
Good morning. I'm David Bradley. I have a question for you, Peter. How are we gaining the intelligence to be having such successful drone attacks in Pakistan? And is that drone program a significant thing, or is it just part of a grinding war?
Thank you very much, sir. As you know, the Obama administration has authorized more drone attacks, 53 last year, than the entire Bush administration. And clearly, in 2006, there was very few intelligence assets in the United States in the federally administered tribal areas. That's changed fairly dramatically. But there is a large question about the drone program, leaving aside the question of civilian casualties. We at the New America Foundation have calculated that the casualty rate right now is about 24%, which is much lower than some have said and higher than others. But the real question is, how efficacious is this program now on the insurgency? And I don't know the answer to that, but in Afghanistan there was a record number of suicide attacks last year. Most of those suicide attacks, the people doing those attacks were recruited in Pakistan's tribal regions. Similarly, Pakistan had a record year for suicide attacks. So the drone program has been somewhat effective in disrupting Al-Qaeda and the Pakistani Taliban, no doubt, but clearly they're resilient enough to continue to launch a major insurgency in both countries. I think we're going to have to, because you asked a rather complex and very good question, I think if everybody could perhaps address essentially, what does this mean going forward, is I guess your question.
Yeah, I might just point out that the Pentagon does have a program called Human Terrain Teams, which does send social scientists. They're embedded with units, and it's controversial among anthropologists who question whether sort of the anthropologists' vow to do no harm is in conflict with this, whereas others very strongly defend it. And my sense is that we don't yet know the effectiveness of that program.
Any other thoughts?
Addressing your question, I think the colonel said it best when he said exposure. I know that the soldiers that I led in Iraq doing interrogations, they could tell you the year that Muhammad was born. They could tell you the difference between Sunni and Shia because they'd learned all that off a PowerPoint slide. But they couldn't tell you the nuances within the culture that would allow them to use that to convince people to cooperate with us. And that only comes from exposure.
I think ultimately what you're hearing is the importance of an interdisciplinary effort. The odds that we're going to be able to get somebody who really understands the nuances of culture as well as understands the social networking and the military component and the intelligence component, I don't think we're going to be able to make these sort of super soldiers or intellectually super soldiers, if you will. And I think it would be a mistake to try. We already do quite a bit of professional education. General Abizaid, who's the distinguished chair at the Combating Terrorism Center, says he spent a third of his career in uniform in school in one form or another, and I think that that's important to continue to do because I think that gives commanders the tools that they need and helps them understand situations. But even within that, you're only going to be able to gain so much knowledge. And I think it highlights the fact of bringing in people from different disciplines, not just anthropology. I actually think that one of the potential weaknesses of the human terrain teams, which I think was absolutely revolutionary when they put it in place. Unfortunately, my understanding is it's winding down, and there's not necessarily a clear plan on how to continue it, or whether or not it should be continued, was that it focused only on anthropology. And I think that there are other aspects of disciplines of political science and power and economics and all these other things that we need to be able to bring to bear. So,
Colonel Hickey, the last word is for you.
Yeah, I would. My bias is towards the study of history and And since I'm a soldier, I think what I've learned in my development in life is there's not much new under the sun. And having active tours in places like Bosnia or in Iraq a couple times over, or even in Germany back in the days of the interzonal border when there still was a wall between East and West Germany. When you step into those environments, history didn't begin at that moment. There's a past, and that past shapes the people living in that area. And as a professional soldier, there are literally thousands of examples in various books of how soldiers solve problems on foreign ground against pretty tough opponents. And with my role in the Army being an armored cavalryman, you know, my stock and trade is combat information. We're the guys that move out ahead of everybody else and find out if the general's guess is right. And if not, we say, you want to go left, you don't want to go right. I know there's a bridge on your map, but it's not there anymore. And please send help. We're already 30 kilometers beyond the river. I would say the development of leaders, at least in my profession, I think ought to be anchored on the lessons of soldiers that have gone before us. And dealing with what the curious soldier will find out is, indeed, he's not alone. It may be cold and dark, and he hasn't been fed in 3 days, but he's not alone. People have been here before. Or this is sort of like that situation that I thought and read about 15 years ago when I was at West Point. But he also learned that will and determination, coupled with imagination and courage, sometimes rules the day. Because your opponent's human too, and he's got the same uncertainties. And sometimes, as one brigadier of the British Army once told me, intrepid men can sometimes grab the pendulum of battle and just shift it, if only for a moment. And I learned that at Lafayette River Crossing a couple years ago when we were studying a little action in the Battle of the Normandy on the ground there, where American paratroopers held off reinforcing German troops to secure the first town in France that we liberated in 1944. And it was just a handful of brave paratroopers that held off superior forces just long enough, certainly facing death, without question, until soldiers from my division, the 4th Division, came in from Utah Beach and consolidated that little piece of ground they held in the face of great danger and uncertainty, so that a greater victory can be secured. And that's where it sort of started for my Army in that one little period of time. So I'd say our leaders, as we grow them, should be imbued in the knowledge of the people who have gone before them and teach them that they dealt with the uncertainty and the danger quite well, and they should never underestimate their ability to do the same. And I place great stock on the intrepidness and daring and guts of my comrades right now. And they are winning small victories and important victories every day. And they are facing mortal danger. And they make it look easy. And so I would say that sort of development in leaders, that investment in leaders, from my point of view, in my profession, that historical context is of huge importance as they apply the new technologies and the current doctrine of the day and try to solve the problems of the day, and realize that there are principles that can be applied. And the rest is an open canvas that they can work on.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. They were brilliant presentations.